Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Mind and Deen Podcast. So today's episode is going to be a little bit different as we have a guest. So joining us today is Dr. Nadia Huq. Welcome Nadia.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum to you all.
So Dr. Nadia is an established child and adolescent psychologist, licensed both in New York and New Jersey. She earned her bachelor's in brain behavior and cognitive science from University of Michigan, and followed by a master's and a PhD in clinical psychology from UNC Greensboro in 2016. And she also completed her predoctoral internship at Children's National Health Systems and a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical child psychology at NYP COIMC. Is that right?
Yes, so that stands for New York Presbyterian Columbia University Medical Center. I know so many letters and acronyms. But yes, that is accurate.
Okay. So you have served as a clinical psychologist and faculty member at Columbia University Irving Medical Center for the last 6 years. And you specialize in therapy for children and families, and have a special interest in dealing with intergenerational trauma and child-parent relationships. And you recently in 2023, joined the TMB Psychological Services and do a little bit of outreach work as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So yes, I stayed on after my fellowship at New York Presbyterian and served as a psychologist and faculty member there for about 6 years. And then last summer, I left the hospital to be able to kind of do a few, some things, this outreach, work with South Asian communities, work with, immigrant families and kind of the communities that I feel close to. So left the hospital last year and joined private practice. And yeah, I'm working with families and individuals, uh, all groups, but doing a lot of work with anxiety, depression, ADHD.
Amazing. How have you been finding the switch from public to private services?
Yes, it's very different. Mixed feelings always, there are, uh, so many things I would love to do with my time. There's only so many hours in a day. So it's definitely different, but the work is still what I'm passionate about, which it comes down to helping families and helping kids and, uh, also fighting this stigma for mental illness and mental health and hoping to improve access to care for all that need it. So I'm still able to do what I love, just a different avenue.
Yeah, and
Amazing.
thank you so much for joining us today. We're honored to have you on our show. And yeah.
Yeah. So as you guys may be aware, the aim of our podcast is to increase awareness, allow for open conversations within the Muslim community. So in today's episode, we will be openly talking about how to break the stigma and to increase access and to change the narrative around mental health with a particular focus on intergenerational trauma within the Muslim Asian community. So, Dr. Nadia, what is your understanding of intergenerational trauma for our listeners that may not be familiar with the term?
Yes, that's a great question. So this has been a bit of a hot topic, in the last couple of decades, really thinking about what generational trauma is. And simply, kind of simply put, if you think about generations before us, right? Of all communities, if generations before us went through a famine, war, stress, all the kind of stressors you can think of, it's this idea that then does impact future generations, your offspring. Not necessarily changes your DNA, but can change the expression of genes. So if your great grandparents went through war and famine, that these are not isolated things. There could be things in your own kind of gene expression or that can impact your emotional well-being. So that's kind of the main gist of what that means.
Yeah.
So kind of come from like learned behaviors.
Yeah, learned. I'm glad you mentioned that. So there is an aspect of it that could be learned, right? So lots of times if you imagine a group of people maybe going through a war or stress or famine or, like racism, that then does impact you biologically, right? Cortisol, stress levels, things like that, but also can impact how you parent your children, right? So that's kind of that behavioral piece. It could impact how you parent your children, right? If your mind is really occupied with all these life-threatening things or you're not as available. So then it can impact parenting, which then can impact the attachment a parent and a child have, which then impacts that child, right? And then that can impact their child. So it's this idea of, on this biological level, there are some changes, but also that learned piece, the behavioral piece.
Yeah, good. I think I've heard of the term like so many times, but I've never really actually realized how complex it can be.
Yes. And I'm
Yeah.
not a geneticist or biologist, so I can't speak to all of the nitty-gritty in terms of what it means from that biological genetic perspective. But as a clinical psychologist, it is definitely something that I think a lot about because I'm a true believer that we just don't exist in this world by ourselves. We're a part of families, which are a part of bigger families, which are a part of communities, which are a part of a bigger history, right? So I think it's important to think about all of those things. For me, when I think of families that come to me, I think about all those things when I conceptualize a case or, um, and think about mental illness in the family and different things like that.
Yeah. I think definitely it's a term that's been thrown around quite a bit, and not a lot of people understand like the deep-rooted impact it can have. So like you said, the biological and the behavioral or environmental aspect and how that kind of carries on and kind of molds families, and it's quite hard to break out of it, I can assume.
Yeah.
Okay, so following up with that, the next question is, in your practice, how have you seen the impact of intergenerational trauma in families, and what does it look like, particularly in the Muslim and Asian community?
That's a good question. So what I will say that I've noticed the most, uh, because of what I do is really kind of from a parenting perspective. So I work with young kids, but I work a lot with parents. And what I have found when people come to me, it's a lot of, this is how I was parented, or this is how my parents raised me, but I want to do something differently for my kids, or I want to be more X, Y, and Z. So in my experience, that's kind of what comes up. So I'll have parents that come to me that identify as South Asian American, Muslim American, parents were immigrants, parents grew up somewhere else, and they'll come to me and be like, they were very strict in this type of way. And so I wasn't really connected to them, or this is what I went through because I felt like I couldn't talk to my parents, but I want to do different for my kids, or my kid is having a lot of trouble, but I don't want to discipline the way my parents did. So that's kind of a small piece of it. This isn't going back like generation. It is going back generations, but that's one of the things that comes up the most in my parenting work. And I work with a lot of parents on, yes, it's important to have a warm parenting relationship, and having boundaries, right? So you don't want to swing too much in either direction, right? Too strict or totally like do whatever you want because my parents were strict, right? Like that's not healthy either. And you don't want your kids to be afraid of you, like many of us may have been with our parents, but you also don't want them to be like, oh, my mom's my best friend, because you're not really friends, right? So it's like finding that balance. That's a lot of the work I do with parents on helping them have like secure, warm attachments with their kids that are healthy and still have boundaries. So I would say that's kind of a big piece of what I do and how this work has shown up in my day to day.
So,
I was just going to say, I feel like finding that balance must be really hard. Because obviously, I feel like the parents who are kind of like strict, obviously they just kind of want to protect you, or like, they're just a bit cautious of things. So it's hard for them to like let go. But then obviously you said, you don't want to just be like a best friend of your mom because that's also quite strange. But
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like finding that balance can sometimes be really hard for families.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think probably with kids, like smaller kids, can be a bit difficult to they're like trying to figure out like because they're coming with their own experience of wanting to change parenting styles, like you said, from their own experience, but also like finding what works best for their child probably is something that they have to think about in building that relationship. Um,
Mm.
and I think that's something that I've also seen because I work with parents, obviously not at such a high level as you do, but also like parents come with their own experience and it's just telling them that there are different ways to find that good balance, but also just focusing on the relationship between them and their child, I think is the primary focus of um, this kind of work, I think, working with parents. So,
I agree with you. That's something I commonly tell parents. And I'm a mother, so I get it. I have two young girls, they're 4 and 6. And as a parent, so, you want to do all that you can for your children and make sure they're successful and, of course, safe and have good values, right? And I think that sometimes, especially people in the Muslim community or South Asian community, it's amplified if there's an immigrant, if the parents are immigrants and the children are US born, right? So there's so many different layers. And I think sometimes out of fear, the older generations parented out of fear because you're in a new environment. You're in a place where you yourself didn't grow up. So there was a lot of this like, oh, we have to drill these values in. And it came more from a fear, perspective. And one of the things I like to tell families is you can teach all your values to your children and not do it in a fear-based way. You can have a good relationship with them. And if you work on the relationship and if you model, these good values, and if you help expose your kids to, you know, family values by going to a lot of family things, staying connected with family, showing how important family is, uh, those are healthy ways to instill values without just being like, you have to do this because of da, 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 right? And so I think that's a bit of the shift that I try to help parents see is that if you have a good relationship with your kids, then they'll listen to you more, right? And if you model how important family is by you yourself being really respectful to your parents, right? So that your kids seeing you be respectful to your parents, or your young kids, like, see me being very close to my mother-in-law and my mom and my parents, and we're all very close and we see each other often. So I don't have to keep telling them like family's important because that's just how we live our life and they see it. So yes, and I think having a good relationship is really important because then kids are more likely to take in what you're seeing, what that you're saying.
yeah, that's really interesting because I think the natural instinct is to like say and give orders rather than focusing on your behavior, on how you act around your kids. And I think that's probably more important, like you said, than actually just giving them rules.
Yeah. And I have this funny example, right? So I don't know, when we were growing up, we were the first generation of American born, really Bangladeshi Americans in our area. My dad immigrated in the 70s. And it was so funny because when we were growing up, we were one of the few, South Asian families. My parents had a really close knit of few groups of friends, and it would often come up these, funny things like, oh, like, don't ever put us in a retirement home like the white people, these like funny kind of things like, or, whatever you do, don't stick us in those homes, kind of this fear. And I would always joke like, what do you think, we're not going to just like abandon you as, when we get older, but this kind of fear. And it's so interesting because I reflect on as a kid, my mom would tell me these things and I'm like, what is she even talking about? Like, I was so young. But as I grew up watching my mom take care of my grandmother and watching how my mother-in-law took care of my husband's grandmother, like, you don't have to say things all the time in this way. You can model it, and that's so much more, I think can be impactful. So I think with immigrant communities, South Asian Muslim, there's all this like, we got to hold on to our values, and people kind of stress out about it. And I like to help everyone, the parents I work with, take a step back and relax and know that there will be a lot of blending of different cultures, but having kind of a fear-based way of teaching your kids is usually not gonna be that effective. So
Yeah, that's a really good point. And do you think that this is more common now because we live in such a diverse world and everyone's like moving around all the time and have so many different like cultures and values and things to kind of manage and balance and probably choose from?
yeah, it's so much blending, right? And I don't know about your families, but like, I was the first generation American growing up, me and my siblings, my parents before that, Bangladesh, India, and so we were really the first generation where we're like, there's so many different cultures, right? And, mixed. And I think there is a natural fear that comes with that and balancing, because there are values conflicts that happen when a parent grew up in a different country and a child grows up in a different country. There's a very normal, natural, developmentally appropriate kind of conflict that happens. It's just how families manage it and deal with it that is most important.
So
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was just gonna say how that fear of like growing old and then being abandoned in a home, I think is quite a natural common fear, because obviously once your children grow up and they get married and they have their own
Yeah.
families, their own children, their own lives, naturally you just think, oh, they're gonna kind of move on, forget about me. But like you said, it's just about managing those expectations within the family, really.
Yeah, and having a good relationship with your children, right? And I think that uh, that's what I like to emphasize to people. Like, if you really nurture that relationship with your child, like in an appropriate way, warmth, we communicate, and there's boundaries, uh, then you don't have to worry so much about like what's going to happen all these years later, because a solid, good relationship usually leads to good things, right? And so I think that's one of the things I really like to encourage um, the families that I work with to
yeah.
give attention to those relationships.
Yeah, definitely. And so you did mention that instilling this like sense of positive relationship is like one of the core aspects of working with parents. But what else do you focus on when you work with clients that come in with these problems or experience intergenerational trauma or similar difficulties? Like how do you
Yeah.
like best support them?
So that's a good question, and it depends on the age, right? So I do work with a lot of parents and young kids, but I do have young adults in their 20s that come to me that are still struggling with their relationships with their families or their own identity and navigating all these things, or my parents really want me to get married and I'm not ready to get married, or, all the things that come with that. And when I work with, so it really depends on the age group, right? So there's a different approach to an extent with different age groups. But when uh, people come to me that are more in their 20s, it's a lot of, okay, well, focusing on controlling what you can control, right? You can't change other people, but you can what you do for yourself, right? And I think it's a lot of what's within your control, right? What is not in your control that you may have to let go. A part of it is working on communication. A part of it is finding your own like healing, right? And through a lot of storytelling and, a lot of like, what do you think it was like when your parents were growing up? What do you think made your parents parent you the way you parented? Like, and kind of just like talking through those things. And then some tangible, like, okay, if mom calls you one more time and asks you when you're going to get married and that's going to make you really upset, what are some appropriate boundaries you can set? Like, and I tell people this, you can say, Mom, when I find someone as amazing as dad, okay, I'm going to get married, right? Sometimes things like that. Or, I want to find someone too, Mom, like keep looking, or, just like how do you respond? And it doesn't always have to be so serious or so intense, but really navigating those situations and making sure that people are taking care of their own mental health, right? Engaging in therapy, exercise, eating right, staying social, so all those kind of things that help keep your mood, your mind and body in a good place.
So a very
Yeah.
holistic approach to everything, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure.
Just
So
shows how important it is to be mindful of your speech as well. Like when you are talking to your parents or elders, that you don't have to do it in such a negative way. Like just
Yeah.
do the words a bit to strengthen that relationship, of course.
Yes. And I think and every family is different, right? And it's hard to do this broad sweep. There's so much intersection of identities, right? There's the South Asia, the cultural, there's the religious, there's the immigration status, there's education, there's, socioeconomic status. There's so many different things that impact the way a family functions. But I do think that, communication is important, and I think lots of times things don't. I like to encourage people to bring in a little, warmth and humor, even if your parents aren't necessarily that way, to, break the ice a little bit. And sometimes you're surprised by how people react, So I think we do a little bit of exploration. Okay, try it this way and see how your family responds. Or try this way and let's see what happens,
yeah.
All while being respectful, I think, of course, which is, important value, I think.
Yeah, I think definitely communicating is something that a lot of Asian families need to work on because I don't know what it is, but there's a whole, I think it's the boundaries you set with parents and your children, but I think it's very difficult for a lot of families to just have open communications, and it doesn't have to be serious, like you said. It can just be coming from a place of warmth and love, but just practicing that can do so many good things. And I think that's a really good.
And being mindful, though, it also depends on your age, right? So I would talk to, if, I have a client in their early 20s or 24, 25, I would guide them to talk to their parents a little bit differently than I would with a 14 or 15-year-old, right? So there is this natural, though, what's appropriate, and being mindful of that. But as folks get older, encouraging more open conversation, which I think can be hard in South Asian community because your parents are still oh, you're kind of scared of your parents. But I think, empowering people to, as they get older, to speak up more, but respectfully, and have conversations in a way that maybe didn't happen when you're younger, right? Yeah.
Would you say it's a two-way kind of thing? So parents have to do their bit, and also the children have to do their bit, and kind of finding it in between.
Yes, it is, right? And that's the hard part. I think the hardest is when people come to me and their parents are really stuck kind of in their ways or really don't want to shift. But that I have found more is rare. I think parents, especially who also have maybe, because I work a lot with immigrant families or in just the community, people have also, the parental generation, the oldest, have also adjusted a little bit too, because they've been living abroad for so many years now. So I think ideally both sides would kind of be working together and communicating. And sometimes it's a little bit harder, right? And then we deal with that the best we can.
Hi guys, we hope you enjoyed the first part of our interview with Dr. Nadia. Stay tuned for the next part of the series coming soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.